Welcome to Justspiracy, the podcast that delves into true crime and mystery stories from around the world. I'm your host, Jessica, and in each episode, we'll explore the details and theories surrounding some of the most notorious cases in history. From unsolved mysteries to infamous killers, we'll examine the evidence, discuss the impact of these crimes, and attempt to uncover the truth. So, grab a cup of coffee and join me on this journey as we navigate the murky waters of the unknown and attempt to unravel the mysteries of the world around us. To tell the complete story of the man who committed a variety of crimes, from burglaries to rapes and eventually several murders, it's crucial to start from the beginning of his criminal activity. This started in the early to mid-1970s with a string of burglaries that happened in the city of Visalia, located in the Central Valley of California. The perpetrator was known as the Visalia ransacker, and he had a distinct pattern of breaking into homes when the occupants were away and stealing small items like coins and jewelry. But soon, his crimes escalated to something far more sinister. He began returning to the same homes weeks or even months later to rape the female occupants. The Visalia ransacker was not only ruthless, but also highly organized and methodical in his approach. He would spend hours in the homes before carrying out his attacks, planning every detail meticulously. He also had a disturbing habit of calling his victims months or even years later to taunt them about the attacks. On the night of September 11, 1975, a tragic event took place at the home of Claude Snelling, who was believed to be his first victim. Snelling was a journalism professor at the College of Sequoias and had previously chased a prowler away from his daughter's window earlier that year. On this particular night, he was woken up by strange noises around 2 a.m. When he went to investigate, he found a ski-masked intruder attempting to kidnap his daughter. The intruder had threatened to stab or shoot her if she didn't comply. Snelling confronted the intruder and was shot twice. He managed to stumble back to his wife inside the house before passing away. After the murder, the killer fled the scene but left behind a stolen bicycle. Beth Snelling, Claude's 16-year-old daughter, underwent hypnosis in order to gather further information. The Visalia police also committed more resources to apprehending the ransacker, and a reward of $4,000 was posted. This was a substantial amount of money at the time, equivalent to almost $20,000 in today's currency. The police set up a nighttime stakeout near the houses that the ransacker had previously prowled, but unfortunately the ransackings continued. At approximately 8:30 p.m. on December 12, 1975, an individual wearing a mask entered the backyard of a residence located at 1505 West Quay Avenue, near an area where the ransacker was known to frequent. Detective William McGowan, who was on stakeout inside the garage, attempted to detain the intruder, but the suspect reacted by screaming, removing his mask, and pretending to surrender after McGowan fired a warning shot. However, as the suspect jumped the fence to the neighboring house at 1501, he pulled out a revolver with his left hand and fired a shot close to McGowan's face, shattering his flashlight. Other officers nearby rushed to help, but the shooter managed to escape. Among the items left behind were the broken flashlight, tennis shoe tracks, blue chip stamps, and a sock filled with coins, which were collected as evidence. The crimes committed by the Visalia ransacker were truly terrifying, but little did anyone know that this was only the beginning of a much more extensive and heinous crime spree that would continue for years and spread across California. From 1976 to 1979, in the bustling city of Sacramento, the capital of California, known for its parliament, treasury, and governor's residence, a tragic reality loomed beneath the surface. It was the home of one of the most notorious serial predators in the country's history, a monster whose reign of terror began unfolding. The landscape was marked by vast open spaces, plentiful jobs, new housing developments, and a sense of small-town innocence. A sense of innocence that was shattered with each and every brutal attack he carried out. It was 1976, a time when the Golden State Killer was not yet known. One of his victims recounts the chilling morning when it all began. As she lay in bed at around 6:30 a.m., her husband was about to leave for work, and her 3-year-old snuggled up beside her. Suddenly, within just a couple of minutes, a bright light illuminated the hallway, followed by a sound of someone running towards her. Before she could even process what was happening, she was face to face with a masked man wielding a large butcher knife. Tragically, Jane Carson Sandler was the next target on his list, marking her as victim number 5 of a serial rapist who had been stalking the suburbs surrounding Sacramento. She went on to describe how he proceeded to gag, blindfold, and tie both her and her son up by their ankles and their wrists with shoelaces. Following the sexual assault of Jane, the perpetrator lingered in her home for over an hour, rummaging through her cupboards and even preparing a meal before finally leaving. At the start, he had a specific approach of targeting middle-class areas during nighttime, with the intention of finding solitary women who were residing in single-story homes near open spaces such as schools, trails, or creeks, which would facilitate a quick getaway. There were several sightings of him during this time, and he managed to evade capture every time. In fact, he even shot and caused serious injury to a young person who had tried to chase him down on one occasion. Most victims had seen or heard a prowler on their property before the attacks, and many had experienced break-ins. The police suspected that the perpetrator would extensively survey the area in a specific neighborhood, looking into windows and prowling in yards before selecting a home to attack. It was believed that he sometimes entered the homes of future victims to unlock windows, unload guns, and plant ligatures for later use. He would often make phone calls to his future victims, sometimes months prior to the attack, to gather information about their daily habits and routines. Although he originally targeted women alone in their homes or with their children, he eventually preferred attacking couples. This change in MO is believed to be a direct result of media reports claiming he only attacked women alone in the home. His usual method was to break in through a window or sliding glass door and awaken sleeping occupants with a flashlight, threatening them with the gun. Victims were subsequently bound with ligatures, often shoelaces, that he found or brought with him, then blindfolded and gagged them with towels that he had ripped into strips. The female victim was usually forced to tie up her male companion before she was bound. The bindings were often so tight that the victim's hands were numb for hours after being untied. He then separated the couple, often stacking dishes on the male's back and threatening to kill everyone in the house if he heard them rattle. He would then move the female to the living room and rape her, often again and again. He sometimes spent hours in the home, ransacking closets and drawers, eating food in the kitchen, drinking beer, or making additional threats. Victims sometimes thought he had left the house before he jumped out at them from the dark. He typically stole items, often personal objects, and items of little value, but occasionally cash and firearms. He would then creep away, leaving victims uncertain whether he had left. He was believed to escape on foot through a series of yards and then use a bicycle to go home or to a car, making extensive use of parks, schoolyards, creeks, beds, and other open spaces that kept him off the street. The public became increasingly concerned as the man continued to attack women, leaving many to question why the police had not yet been able to apprehend him. The story of a predator on the loose was being covered in nearly every news bulletin in Sacramento, and he was quickly named the East Area Rapist. The mounting number of assaults only served to escalate the fear of the community. The frequency of attacks had escalated to the point where the community was experiencing at least one assault every week, and there had even been 2 rapes in one night. According to an investigator, hardware stores were struggling to keep up with the demand for locks as people were frantically buying them along with firearms to arm themselves. Anyone could have been a suspect, and law enforcement officials even considered the possibility that the perpetrator had a background in law enforcement or the military, given his ability to evade capture. His level of sophistication and meticulous planning suggested that he was not an amateur, and this only fueled the public's growing fear and mistrust. Margaret Wardlow would become the youngest victim of the East Area Rapist at 13. Interestingly, Margaret had developed an obsession with the case and had meticulously studied numerous newspaper articles about the attacks. Thus, when the assailant targeted her, she instinctively knew what was required to stay alive. She recognized his MO, which involved placing dishes on the back of his victims. When 13-year-old Margaret heard the plates rattling on her mother's back, she knew exactly what to expect. Despite the fear, Margaret began talking herself through the situation, reassuring herself that she would make it through and everything was going to be okay. Through her courageous effort, Margaret showed that she knew the suspect's desire for power and control through fear. She made sure to tell him that she was not afraid of him, refusing to give him that power. During the years of 1977 and 1978, a person claiming to be the East Area Rapist made a string of frightening phone calls. On March 18, 1977, 3 calls were made to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office. The first 2 were identical and ended with the caller laughing and hanging up. The final call came with the caller saying, "I'm the East Area Rapist, and I have my next victim already stalked and you guys can't catch me." In later months, the caller made a few more calls taunting police and previous victims. For example, on December 9, 1977, a previous victim received a call with a caller saying, "Merry Christmas, it's me again." In January of 1978, a man claiming to be the East Area Rapist called a counseling service and said, "I have a problem. I need help because I don't want to do this anymore." After a short conversation, the caller said, "I believe you are tracing this call," and hung up. There were several other calls to previous victims in later years as well. Unfortunately, the East Area Rapist's craving for violence began to escalate, and the investigators knew that he was ready to kill. In 1979, the reign of terror of the East Area Rapists abruptly came to an end, leaving investigators baffled with no apparent explanation. Little did they know that their worst nightmare had come true. The sadistic predator had moved on, becoming even more bold. When he resurfaced in Southern California, he had evolved into a full-blown serial killer. Shortly after the rape committed on July 5, 1979, the suspect moved to Southern California and began killing his victims. first striking in Santa Barbara County in October. The attacks lasted until 1981, with a lone attack in 1986. Only the couple in the first attack survived, alerting neighbors and forcing the intruder to flee. The other victims were murdered by gunshot or bludgeoning. During that period, authorities were not linking the incidents to the same perpetrator. He was now known as the Night Stalker in the area, before being renamed the original Night Stalker after serial killer Richard Ramirez received the former nickname. An investigator later stated, "He is probably the only offender that I know who has had different aliases." On March 13th, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were found murdered in their Ventura home. The wife, 33-year-old Charlene Smith, had been raped. A log from a woodpile on the side of the house was used to bludgeon the victims to death. Their wrists and ankles had been bound with drapery cord. An unusual diamond knot was used on Charlene's wrists. The same knot was noted in the East Area Rapist's attacks. The murderer was, therefore, briefly given the name Diamond Knot Killer. The same suspect murdered 13 people across the state of California, added to the 50 rapes, various other assaults, and kidnappings. He became one of the United States' most hunted fugitives, now known as the Golden State Killer. In 1994, Detective Paul Holes began working on this case, just as DNA technology was becoming a valuable tool for law enforcement. Since 2001, the DNA of the Golden State Killer was entered into the FBI's National DNA Database, CODIS, which includes over 16 million profiles. However, it did not match any of the profiles in the database because the suspect's DNA had not been previously linked to any crime that required DNA to be taken. In 2017, Detective Paul Holes discovered a groundbreaking technique that other law enforcement agencies were using to track down persons of interest in criminal cases. By taking DNA samples found at crimes and entering them into a public database such as Ancestry.com and GEDmatch, where individuals voluntarily submit their own DNA for genealogy and ancestry information. After collecting DNA from the Golden State Killer, Holes proceeded to upload it to a genealogy website, GEDmatch, under a false profile to search for potential matches. In less than a day, he received a list of potential relatives to the killer. This provided Holes with a starting point for his investigation, resulting in a list of 5 individuals who fit the criteria based on their age. Holes had to sift through these potential suspects to identify who they were and determine if any of them could be the perpetrator. It was during this process that Holes came across the name Joseph James D'Angelo, who fit the Golden State Killer's profile perfectly. He had lived in Sacramento and was the right age to commit the crimes. After watching him for days, police were able to take a used tissue out of his garbage bin and tested it against the Golden State Killer's DNA, resulting in a definite match and positively identifying Joseph D'Angelo as the notorious serial killer. Shockingly, D'Angelo had, in fact, been a police officer. During his time in law enforcement, he committed the first 45 rapes and 2 murders. However, at the time, his criminal spree was cut short temporarily when he was caught shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer. The police chief had arrested him immediately, and a few weeks later, a prowler appeared outside the chief's daughter's window. The chief believed it was the vengeful D'Angelo, but he shockingly never followed it up. This missed opportunity was a significant clue that could have potentially stopped all the killings. Joseph D'Angelo, who had committed his first rape 42 years earlier, was finally arrested at his home after all those years on April 24th, 2018. He had been hiding in plain sight as a retired father of 3 daughters and had been married to a local divorce lawyer. Ironically, despite specializing in divorce, she had been estranged from him since 1991, but hadn't divorced him until 2019. Most of the offenses committed by D'Angelo were during the time when he was married and raising a family. Surprisingly, neither his wife nor his children had any inkling that he was committing such heinous crimes. His eldest daughter thought of him as the perfect father, while his wife trusted his reasons for being away from home. He was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and the Santa Barbara County District's office charged D'Angelo with 4 additional counts of first-degree murder. D'Angelo made a confession of sorts after his arrest that cryptically referred to an inner personality named Jerry, who had forced him to commit the wave of crimes that ended abruptly in 1986. According to Sacramento County prosecutor, D'Angelo said the following to himself while alone in a police interrogation room after his arrest, saying, "I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like in my head, he's a part of me. I didn't want to do those things. I pushed Jerry out and had a happy life. I did all those things. I destroyed all their lives, so now I've got to pay the price." Joseph D'Angelo could not be charged with the rapes or burglaries, as the statute of limitations had expired for those offenses, but he was charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. D'Angelo was arraigned in Sacramento on August 23, 2018. Prosecutors from 6 involved counties collectively estimated that the case could cost taxpayers $20 million and last 10 years. At an April 2019 court proceeding, prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty, and the judge ruled the cameras could be allowed inside the court during the trial. On March 4, 2020, D'Angelo offered to plead guilty if the death penalty were taken off the table, which was not accepted at the time. But on June 29th, as part of a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and special circumstances, including murder committed during burglaries and rapes, as well as 13 counts of kidnapping. On August 21, 2020, D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. D'Angelo offered a brief apology after listening to days of pre-sentencing victim impact statements, saying, "I've listened to all of your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." Reflecting on the many horrific incidents committed by a monster, 3 things stand out: the crucial role of forensic science, the lasting impact of trauma, and the strength of perseverance. That's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. Your support helps more than you know. Also, please be sure to check out my YouTube channel, where I'll be sharing video versions of these episodes, along with exclusive content. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, or want to share your own stories, please feel free to reach out. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always remember to look beyond the headlines.